This episode is a trackpads.com production.
When the attack opened on the morning of the 20th of November, 1917, the first and most important result was not simply that British troops moved forward. It was that the battlefield behaved in a way the Western Front had almost trained everyone to stop expecting. For years, offensives had usually begun with warning, then noise, then delay, then slaughter. At Cambrai, the opening instead produced shock, movement, and a sense that the defensive system in front of the British line had been hit before it had fully gathered itself. That is why the first day stands out so sharply. British forces advanced about 5 miles in places, a remarkable gain by the standards of trench warfare. But the deeper importance lies in why that happened, and why German defenders were so badly unsettled in the opening hours. This podcast is accompanied by a companion book that expands the story of the Battle of Cambrai, with additional historical context, maps, and dozens of enhanced colorized photographs from the battle. Your purchase helps support our mission to keep these podcasts free. You can find the book at militaryauthor.me or at trackpads.com. The Germans were not fools, and it would be misleading to describe them as sleeping through the approach to battle. They held one of the strongest defensive systems on the Western Front, and by late 1917 they understood perfectly well that the British were always looking for some new way to break the line. But armies do not simply defend against every possibility equally. They build habits, assumptions, and expectations around the forms of danger they have seen most often. By the autumn of 1917, one of those expectations was that a major British attack would normally be announced by lengthy preliminary bombardment, visible preparations, and the sort of mounting pressure that gave defenders time to alert artillery, shift reserves, and settle themselves into a defensive rhythm. What stunned the Germans at Cambrai was not complete ignorance. It was the shattering of that rhythm. When the British attack began, the defenders were hit by a combination they had not experienced on that scale in that form. The barrage arrived without the old prolonged warning. Smoke added concealment and confusion. Tanks appeared in mass, not as scattered novelties, but as a broad armored wave tied to infantry and artillery timing. The British assault, therefore, landed not as a sequence the Germans could parse step by step, but as a compressed shock that forced several reactions at once. Local defenders had to survive shell fire, interpret smoke, deal with tanks crushing wire, and respond to infantry already moving into the damaged forward zone. That kind of simultaneity matters. Defensive systems are strongest when threats arrive in a predictable order. They become far more brittle when several threats reach them together before command can restore sequence and control. One of the reasons the first day produced such deep gains is that the British did not ask one arm to do everything alone. Tanks helped break the obstacle belt that had so often strangled earlier infantry assaults. Barbed wire that might have held up attacking battalions for fatal minutes or hours was flattened or breached. Trenches that once imposed long delays at the point of contact could be crossed more quickly where tanks survived to reach them. Meanwhile, the creeping barrage kept defenders suppressed long enough for infantry to close distance before the Germans could fully recover. This combination did not make the battle easy, and it did not work equally well everywhere. But it meant that the British were not attacking the Hindenburg Line as a single blunt mass. They were attacking it as a coordinated system, and that is what made the first impact so disruptive. The psychological effect should not be exaggerated into fantasy, but it should not be minimized either. Tanks had appeared before in the war, so German troops were not seeing an utterly unknown creature for the first time. What was new was the scale, the timing, and the battlefield setting. Machines that had once been rare and unreliable now came forward in such numbers and under such carefully arranged conditions that they stopped being curiosities and started behaving like instruments of rupture. For the infantry in the forward German positions, that meant the usual confidence in wire, trench geometry, and prepared fire zones could suddenly feel less secure than it had looked on paper. Shock in war is often less about terror than about dislocation. Men become stunned when the battlefield no longer unfolds according to the pattern their training and experience taught them to expect. The British opening gains, therefore, came from more than bravery or more than machinery. They came from a temporary collapse in the normal defensive sequence. The Germans were used to buying time for artillery to come down properly, time for machine gun teams to organize fields of fire, time for higher command to understand where the main blow had fallen, time for reserves to move. At Cambrai, the British stole a great deal of that time in the first hours. Villages fell, trench systems were penetrated, and the line in several sectors was driven back with a speed that felt extraordinary when set against the recent misery of Passchendaele. The battlefield did not become fluid in the later mechanized sense, but it moved enough to prove that even a powerful trench defense could be badly shaken if attacked in the right way and on suitable ground. That is why the figure of roughly 5 miles matters. It was not just a statistic for newspaper headlines, although it certainly became that as well. It represented a different rate of battlefield change, one that made contemporaries feel that the deadlock might at last be yielding under intelligent pressure. A gain of that depth on the first day, achieved against a major defensive position, seemed to vindicate months of argument about surprise, predicted fire, tank concentration, and infantry cooperation. It also mattered because the British took prisoners and guns in notable numbers while suffering casualties that, at least in the opening phase, were far lower than the ghastly price that recent offensives had conditioned people to expect. This did not make Cambrai a clean victory, but it did explain why the first shock reverberated far beyond the battlefield itself. Another part of the German surprise lay in the simple fact that their forward system had been designed to absorb a known style of attack. A long bombardment would damage positions, yes, but it would also declare intent. Defenders could shelter in dugouts, reoccupy positions after the barrage lifted, and rely on belts of wire and machine gun fire to break up the enemy once he crossed the open ground. Cambrai upset that logic at the very moment of transition. The British barrage did not wait days and then hand the battle over to exhausted infantry. It opened as the infantry and tanks were already moving. That meant the dangerous handoff between artillery preparation and infantry assault, one of the weakest moments in many older offensives, became far harder for the Germans to exploit. In effect, the British narrowed the gap between suppression and contact, and that was one of the central reasons the defenders were caught off balance. Yet the first shock was not universal, and that matters just as much as the success. Around Flesquières, for example, the German defense proved far tougher than the British hoped. Artillery was brought to bear effectively, tanks were knocked out, and the local pace of the advance slowed badly. This did not cancel the shock elsewhere, but it reminded everyone that even a brilliantly conceived opening could encounter hard resistance the moment surprise weakened and determined local leadership took hold. In military history, that is one of the most useful lessons Cambrai offers. Shock is never evenly distributed across a battlefield. It lands hardest where surprise, firepower, terrain, and confusion combine at once. Where one of those elements falters, the defender may regain coherence much faster than the attacker expects. By the afternoon, that unevenness was already becoming more visible. The British had penetrated deeply in several sectors, but deeper success immediately created harder problems. Tanks were breaking down, being hit, or simply wearing out under the stress of the attack. Infantry had to continue clearing, consolidating, and orienting themselves in a battlefield that no longer matched the tidy plan of the early morning. Canal crossings and bottlenecks suddenly mattered more than the opening breach itself. The Germans, though stunned, were not destroyed. They were beginning to recover, to pull fragments of the defense back together, and to turn the battlefield from a moment of shock into a contest over what that shock would ultimately mean. By the end of the first day, the British had demonstrated a new way of beginning success, but they had not yet solved the larger problem of enlarging it fast enough. That is why the first shock must be understood as both triumph and warning. It was a triumph because it showed that a major trench system could be penetrated by surprise and combined arms rather than only by months of attrition. It was a warning because the opening success began to consume the very resources that made it possible. By the close of the first day, a great many tanks were already out of action, whether from enemy fire, mechanical failure, or sheer battlefield wear. That did not erase what they had accomplished. It simply revealed that even the most startling opening gain could become fragile very quickly if momentum slowed and the defender began to reassemble his strength. The Germans had been stunned, but they had not been rendered incapable of reply. In the longer story of armored warfare, this first day matters because it revealed the precise point at which older trench battle and newer combined arms battle overlapped. The British had not yet achieved the deep, sustained armored exploitation that later generations often imagine when they think of tanks. But they had shown that armor, artillery, smoke, timing, and infantry could together create operational shock against a seemingly solid front. The Germans were stunned, not because one machine had suddenly changed the war by itself, but because several evolving methods had converged into a blow that arrived faster and in a more coordinated way than the defensive system was ready to absorb. That is the lasting significance of the first day at Cambrai. It was not merely an advance. It was a revelation about how battle could begin. So the opening gains of about 5 miles were real, impressive, and historically important. But they should be understood for what they actually were. They were not proof that the British had solved the entire problem of breakthrough, and they were not proof that tanks alone had rendered trench defenses obsolete. They were proof that the Germans could be shocked out of the old defensive rhythm when surprise, artillery science, armored force, and infantry method arrived together on the right ground at the right moment. For a few crucial hours on the 20th of November 1917, that combination made the Hindenburg Line look less like an iron wall and more like a system that could be cracked open. The crack did not become final collapse, but the first shock was enough to change military thinking, and that was achievement enough for one day. You've been listening to Famous Tank Battles. These battles were never just about machines. They were about doctrine, terrain, firepower, logistics, and the hard problem of turning shock into victory. For more military history writing and books, visit militaryauthor.me. And for magazines, podcasts, and a massive archive of military photos and video, visit trackpads.com. Thanks for listening.